The corner office on the 32nd floor of the Meridian Tower had always intimidated junior employees. But after 16 years with Hartwell and Associates, I'd grown comfortable in these surroundings. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of downtown Seattle, and the mahogany desk that dominated the space had witnessed countless deals that built this company's reputation. Today, however, something felt different. The air was thick with tension as I sat across from Richard Hartwell III, the recently appointed CEO who'd inherited the company from his father just 8 months ago. "Lance," he began, his voice carrying that particular tone I'd learned to recognize over the decades, the one executives used when they were about to deliver bad news while pretending it was somehow good for everyone involved. "I've been reviewing our quarterly reports and organizational structure." I nodded politely, my hands folded in my lap. At 51 years old, I'd heard enough corporate speak to translate what was coming. Richard was 28, fresh out of Harvard Business School, and had been making what he called efficiency improvements since taking over from his father. These improvements mostly involved cutting costs by eliminating what he perceived as redundancies. "The board and I have made some difficult decisions about streamlining operations," he continued, shuffling through papers on his desk without really looking at them. "We need to adapt to changing market conditions and optimize our human resources allocation." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was about to consume everything I'd built. I'd started at Hartwell and Associates straight out of college, working my way up from junior account coordinator to senior vice president of sales development. I'd built relationships with clients that spanned decades, managed accounts worth tens of millions of dollars, and mentored dozens of young professionals who'd gone on to successful careers. "What I'm trying to say, Lance," Richard finally looked me directly in the eyes, "is that you're a costly burden to this company." The words hit like a physical blow, but I kept my expression neutral. 16 years of client negotiations had taught me never to show my cards, especially when someone was trying to provoke an emotional reaction. "Your salary, benefits, and commission structure represent a significant drain on our resources," he continued, warming to his theme now. "We've conducted extensive analysis, and frankly, 3 motivated interns can handle your job responsibilities for a fraction of the cost." I felt my jaw clench involuntarily, but maintained my composure. 3 interns. To replace 16 years of experience, relationships, and institutional knowledge. The arrogance was breathtaking, but not entirely surprising. Richard had been making similar statements about other long-term employees for months. "We're prepared to offer you a standard severance package," he said, sliding a manila envelope across the mahogany surface. 2 weeks' pay, continuation of health benefits for 30 days, and a positive reference letter. 2 weeks' pay. For 16 years of building this department from $12 million in annual revenue to over $80 million. For missing family dinners to close deals. For working weekends to accommodate clients in different time zones. For training every new hire who'd walked through these doors. "I understand this is difficult," Richard added, though his tone suggested he found it anything but difficult. "But business is business. We have to make tough decisions to remain competitive." I looked at him for a long moment. This young man who'd never had to earn anything, who'd inherited a company his father had built through decades of hard work and relationship building. His expensive suit, his perfect haircut, his confident smirk. All of it spoke to a fundamental misunderstanding of how business actually worked. "I'm sure they can handle it, sir," I said finally, my voice calm and professional. 3 interns should be more than adequate. If Richard detected any sarcasm in my tone, he didn't show it. Instead, he smiled broadly, apparently pleased that I was taking the news so well. "I'm glad you're being reasonable about this, Lance. Too many people in your position become emotional and make things unnecessarily complicated." He stood up, extending his hand. "I want you to know this isn't personal. It's just smart business." I shook his hand firmly, looking him directly in the eyes. "Of course it isn't personal. It never is." As I walked back to my office to collect my personal belongings, I could hear the whispered conversations that always followed these kinds of meetings. Word traveled fast in corporate environments, and by the time I reached my desk, several colleagues had already offered their condolences and expressed their outrage. "This is insane," said Jennifer Walsh, my longtime assistant and one of the most competent people in the building. "You built this entire department. How can they think interns can replace what you do?" I smiled at her while packing my family photos into a cardboard box. They'll figure it out soon enough. What are you going to do? Asked Mike Chen, one of the junior account managers I'd hired 3 years earlier. You could probably get a job anywhere in the city with your track record. I'm going to take a vacation, I replied honestly. First one in about 5 years. Maybe spend some time figuring out what comes next. What I didn't tell them was that I'd already been having quiet conversations with several clients over the past few months. Richard's cost-cutting measures and his general dismissive attitude toward long-term client relationships had not gone unnoticed. Several major accounts had expressed concerns about the company's direction and had specifically asked about my future plans. The truth was, I'd seen this coming. Not the specific timing, but the general direction. Richard had made it clear from day one that he viewed experienced employees as expensive liabilities rather than valuable assets. He'd been systematically replacing veteran staff with younger, cheaper alternatives, apparently believing that enthusiasm could substitute for expertise. My office had been my second home for 16 years. The walls were covered with awards, photos from client events, and thank you notes from deals that had taken months to close. There was the crystal plaque from Meridian Industries for the largest single contract in company history, a $40 million logistics deal that had taken 8 months to negotiate. There was the framed photo from the company retreat where I'd been named Salesperson of the Year for the 6th time. As I packed these memories into boxes, I couldn't help but think about the relationships I'd built over the years. Marcus Rodriguez at Pacific Manufacturing, who'd started as a junior procurement officer when I first began working with his company and was now their vice president of operations. Sarah Kim at Northwest Distribution, who'd trusted me to handle their expansion into international markets. David Thompson at Cascade Systems, who'd called me personally when their previous vendor had let them down and needed someone reliable to step in. These weren't just accounts on a spreadsheet. They were relationships built on trust, reliability, and mutual respect. They were partnerships that had weathered economic downturns, company reorganizations, and industry changes. They represented millions of dollars in revenue. But more importantly, they represented years of honest communication and delivered promises. Jennifer helped me carry the boxes to my car, her eyes red from trying not to cry. "This is so wrong," she kept saying. "Your clients are going to be furious." "Maybe," I said, though I knew she was probably right. But that's not my concern anymore. That evening, I sat in my home office in the house I'd bought with commissions from those early years at Hartwell & Associates. My wife Susan found me there around 9 o'clock, staring at my computer screen. "How are you feeling?" she asked, settling into the chair across from my desk. "Honestly, relieved," I said, and was surprised to realize it was true. I've been watching that company change for months, watching Richard dismantle everything his father built. Part of me is glad I won't have to watch the rest of it. "What about money?" she asked practically. "We have the mortgage, the kids' college funds." I smiled at her. "I've been getting calls from headhunters for years, and I've got some ideas about consulting opportunities. We'll be fine." What I didn't mention was the conversation I'd had with Tom Hartwell Sr. just 2 weeks earlier. Richard's father had reached out to me privately, expressing his concerns about the direction his son was taking the company. He'd hinted that changes might be coming and had asked if I'd be interested in discussing alternative arrangements once things settled down. The next morning, I slept in for the first time in years. No alarm at 5:30 a.m., no rush to get to the office, no early conference calls with East Coast clients. It was luxurious and strange at the same time. Around 10 o'clock, my phone started ringing. The first call was from Marcus Rodriguez at Pacific Manufacturing. "Lance, I just got a call from some kid at your company telling me he's taking over our account. What the hell is going on?" I explained the situation as diplomatically as possible, but Marcus was furious. 16 years we've been doing business and they think they can just assign some intern to handle a $30 million relationship? This is unacceptable. The second call was from Sarah Kim. "Lance, I need to understand what's happening here. I just received an email from someone named Brad, introducing himself as my new account representative. He misspelled my company name and got our product line completely wrong. Is this some kind of joke?" By noon, I'd received calls from 12 different clients, all expressing similar concerns. They weren't just upset about the change in representation. They were offended by the assumption that their complex business relationships could be handled by inexperienced college students. My phone kept ringing throughout the day. David Thompson from Cascade Systems was particularly blunt. "Lance, I've been doing business with Hartwell and Associates because of you. If you're not there, I'm not there. It's that simple." Around 3 o'clock, Jennifer called. "Lance, it's chaos here. The phones haven't stopped ringing. Clients are demanding to speak with you. And when we explain that you're no longer with the company, half of them are threatening to cancel their contracts." "How's Richard handling it?" I asked. "He's locked in his office. The interns are completely overwhelmed. Brad actually started crying during a call with Northwest Distribution. Sarah Kim asked him a technical question about shipping protocols, and he had no idea what she was talking about." That evening, Susan and I went out to dinner at our favorite Italian restaurant, something we rarely did on weeknights because I was usually working late. It felt strange and liberating at the same time. "Your phone has been quiet for the past hour," Susan observed as we shared a bottle of wine. "I turned it off," I said. "Whatever's happening at Hartwell and Associates isn't my problem anymore." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't entirely true. Those client relationships weren't just professional connections. They were partnerships I'd invested years in building. Watching them fall apart because of corporate arrogance didn't feel like justice. It felt like waste. The next morning, I woke up naturally around 7:30 and made myself a proper breakfast, something I hadn't done in years. As I was reading the newspaper and enjoying my second cup of coffee, my phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Jennifer. "You need to see this." Richard's inbox exploded overnight. 127 emails and counting, all from clients. I poured myself a third cup of coffee and turned my phone back on. Within minutes, it started ringing again. "Lance, thank God," said a familiar voice. It was Patricia Williams from Coastal Enterprises, one of our oldest clients. "I've been trying to reach someone competent at your company for 2 days. We have a crisis situation here, and the kid they assigned to our account keeps putting me on hold to check with his supervisor." "I'm no longer with the company, Patricia," I said gently. "I was let go on Monday." The silence on the other end lasted so long I thought the call had dropped. "They fired you?" "Lance, you've been handling our account for 12 years. You know our business better than some of our own employees. I understand your frustration, but I'm afraid you'll need to work with the new team." "The hell I will," Patricia said, her voice rising. "Lance, I'm pulling our contract. This is unacceptable. Coastal Enterprises does business with people we trust, not whoever's cheapest." Similar conversations continued throughout the morning. Client after client expressing outrage, threatening to leave, demanding explanations. By noon, I'd heard from nearly 30 different companies, representing over $60 million in annual revenue. At 12:47 p.m., my phone rang with a call from Hartwell and Associates. The caller ID showed Richard's direct line. "Lance?" His voice was noticeably less confident than it had been 2 days earlier. "I hope you're settling in well to your transition." "I'm doing fine, Richard. How can I help you?" "Well, we've encountered some minor challenges with the account transitions. Nothing serious, just some communication issues that I'm sure we can resolve." "I see. The thing is, several clients have expressed preferences for maintaining continuity during this adjustment period. They're asking specifically for you, which obviously creates some complications since you're no longer with the company." I waited, letting the silence stretch. This was a negotiation, and the first person to speak usually lost. "What I'm wondering," Richard continued, his voice increasingly strained, "is whether you might be interested in some kind of consulting arrangement. Temporary, of course. Just to help smooth the transition." "What kind of consulting arrangement?" I asked. "Well, we could bring you back on a contract basis. Maybe handle some of the more complex accounts while the new team gets up to speed. The compensation would be competitive." I looked out the window of my home office at the garden Susan had been tending for years, something I'd barely noticed during all those early mornings and late evenings at the office. "What kind of compensation are we talking about?" "We could offer you 75% of your previous salary, no benefits, contract basis." 75%. To fix the mess they'd created by firing me. That's an interesting offer, Richard, but I'm not sure it makes sense for me. What would make sense? He asked, and I could hear the desperation creeping into his voice. Let me think about it and get back to you, I said. I assume this is somewhat time-sensitive? Well, yes. We have several major clients threatening to terminate their contracts if we can't resolve these issues quickly. After hanging up, I sat back in my chair and considered my options. I could return to Hartwell and Associates on my terms, with a significant increase in compensation and much more flexibility. I could walk away entirely and let them deal with the consequences of their decision. Or I could start my own consulting practice, potentially taking some of those clients with me. Over the next few hours, the calls kept coming. Not just from clients now, but from other companies I'd worked with over the years. Word was spreading through the industry that I was available, and several firms were interested in discussing opportunities. At 4:15 p.m., Jennifer called again. Lance, it's a disaster here. Richard's been in emergency meetings all day. The board of directors came in around noon. I heard shouting coming from the conference room. How are the interns handling things? Brad quit this morning, said it was too stressful. The other two are completely overwhelmed. One of them accidentally sent a proposal meant for Pacific Manufacturing to Northwest Distribution. Sarah Kim called and screamed at Richard for 20 minutes. That's unfortunate, I said, though I couldn't suppress a slight smile. There's more. David Thompson from Cascade Systems sent a formal letter terminating their contract. Marcus Rodriguez is demanding a meeting with senior management. And Patricia Williams from Coastal Enterprises just walked into the building with her legal team. At 5:30 p.m., Richard called again. Lance, we need to talk, in person. Can you come in tomorrow morning? I'm not sure that's necessary, Richard. We can handle this over the phone. Please, this situation is more serious than I initially realized. The board is concerned about the client reaction to these changes. I let him wait for my answer. Finally, I said, I can be there at 10 o'clock. Thank you. And Lance? Come prepared to discuss a permanent return arrangement. That evening, Susan and I talked through my options over dinner. She'd been watching the drama unfold with a mixture of amusement and concern. Part of me wants you to walk away, she said. Let them deal with the mess they created, but I know you care about those clients. It's not really about the clients, I said, realizing it as I spoke. It's about principle. Richard dismissed 16 years of experience like it was worthless. Maybe it's time to show him what that experience is actually worth. The next morning, I dressed in my best suit and arrived at Hartwell and Associates at exactly 10 o'clock. The receptionist, who'd known me for years, looked surprised and pleased to see me. Mr. Hartwell is waiting for you in the conference room, she said, along with the board of directors. That was interesting. Richard hadn't mentioned the board would be present. I walked into the large conference room to find not just Richard, but 5 other people seated around the polished table. I recognized most of them, long-term board members who'd worked with Tom Hartwell Sr. for decades. Lance? Richard stood up, extending his hand. Thank you for coming. I shook his hand and nodded to the board members. Good morning, everyone. Margaret Stevens, the board chairwoman, spoke first. Lance, we want to apologize for the way this situation has been handled. We weren't fully informed about Richard's decision to terminate your employment, and we certainly weren't consulted about the transition plan. Richard's face flushed slightly, but he remained silent. We understand you've received numerous calls from concerned clients, continued Robert Morrison, another long-term board member. We'd like to discuss bringing you back to the company with some modifications to your previous arrangement. What kind of modifications? I asked. Margaret looked at Richard, then back at me. We're prepared to offer you the position of Senior Vice President of Client Relations, with a 25% salary increase, enhanced benefits, and equity participation in the company. It was a good offer. Better than good, actually. But I'd spent the past 2 days thinking about what I really wanted from this situation. That's generous, I said, but I have some conditions. What kind of conditions? Richard asked, his voice tight. I looked around the table, meeting each person's eyes. First, I want complete autonomy over the sales department and client relationships. No interference, no second-guessing, no efficiency consultants. Margaret nodded. Reasonable. Second, I want the authority to hire and fire within my department. If I'm responsible for results, I need control over the team. Agreed, said Robert. Third, I looked directly at Richard. I want a written apology to be sent to every client who was affected by this transition, acknowledging that the company made an error in judgment. Richard's jaw tightened, but Margaret spoke before he could. Object. Done. And finally, I paused, knowing this would be the most difficult condition. I want this entire situation to serve as a learning experience. No more arbitrary cost-cutting in departments you don't understand. No more assumptions that experience can be replaced by enthusiasm. If you want to run a successful company, you need to value the people who built it. The room was quiet for a long moment. Finally, Margaret spoke. Those seem like reasonable conditions, Lance. Are you prepared to return to work? I smiled. I can start Monday. As I walked back to my car, Jennifer caught up with me in the parking garage. So, are you coming back? Monday morning, I said, with a few changes to how things are going to work around here. Thank God, she said, looking relieved. It's been absolute chaos. Half the clients are furious, the other half are confused, and Richard's been locked in his office since yesterday afternoon. Over the weekend, I received calls from several of the clients who'd been most upset about the transition. Word had already spread that I was returning to the company, and the mood had shifted dramatically. Lance, I'm glad you're back, said Marcus Rodriguez. I was about to recommend that Pacific Manufacturing find a new vendor entirely. I appreciate your patience, Marcus. Things will be back to normal on Monday. Good, because I've got some new projects coming up that I'd like to discuss. Big ones. Monday morning felt like a homecoming. My office had been left exactly as I'd packed it up, and Jennifer had already scheduled calls with the major clients to personally explain the situation and confirm that I would be handling their accounts going forward. Richard stopped by around 10 o'clock, looking considerably less confident than he had the previous week. Lance, I want you to know that we appreciate you coming back. I'm sure you do, I said, not looking up from the client files I was reviewing. About those conditions you mentioned. What about them? The written apology to clients. The board wants me to draft it personally. I looked up at him. That's appropriate. After all, it was your decision to make those changes. He shifted uncomfortably. Do you have any suggestions for how to word it? I leaned back in my chair. I'd suggest starting with an acknowledgement that the company made an error in judgment. Then explain that you've corrected the situation and that all clients will continue to receive the level of service they've come to expect. And if they ask about you specifically, tell them the truth, that you underestimated the value of experience and that you've learned from the mistake. Over the next few weeks, things gradually returned to normal. The clients settled back into their usual patterns, the crisis atmosphere dissipated, and the interns were reassigned to appropriate entry-level positions where they could actually learn something useful. But the dynamic at the company had changed. Richard was no longer making unilateral decisions about personnel. The board was more involved in operational oversight, and I had gained something I'd never had before: real authority to run my department the way I knew it should be run. 3 months later, our quarterly results showed record revenue in the sales department. Client satisfaction scores were at an all-time high, and 2 of the company's biggest competitors had tried to poach me with offers that would have doubled my salary. Richard called me into his office on a Friday afternoon to discuss the quarterly numbers. These results are impressive, Lance. The board is very pleased. We've got a good team, I said, and we're focused on building long-term relationships rather than just closing quick deals. About what happened before, he began. It's in the past, I said. We've all learned from it. I want you to know that I realize I made some mistakes. About the value of experience, about the importance of client relationships, about a lot of things. I nodded. Experience is expensive, Richard. But inexperience costs more. That evening, as I was driving home, I reflected on the past few months. The firing had been a shock, but it had also been a wake-up call. I'd been so focused on doing my job well that I'd forgotten to protect my position within the company. I'd assumed that results would speak for themselves, that loyalty would be rewarded, that experience would be valued. I'd learned that assumptions could be dangerous in corporate environments. But I'd also learned something more important, that real value couldn't be faked or replaced by cheaper alternatives. The relationships I'd built over 16 years weren't just professional connections. They were the foundation of the company's success. When I got home, Susan was in the kitchen preparing dinner. "How was your day?" she asked. "Productive," I said. "We closed the Morrison Industries deal, 15 million over 3 years." "That's wonderful. You look happy." I considered that. I am happy. For the first time in years, I feel like I'm working for a company that actually values what I bring to the table. 6 months after my return, Tom Hartwell Sr. called and asked me to lunch. We met at his private club downtown, the same place where he'd offered me my first promotion 15 years earlier. "I owe you an apology, Lance," he said over coffee. "I should have been more involved when Richard first took over. I shouldn't have let him make those kinds of decisions without oversight." "It worked out," I said. "Maybe it needed to happen for everyone to understand what was really important. You could have walked away, started your own firm, taken half our clients with you. Why didn't you?" I thought about that question. "Because I believe in this company. Your father built something worth preserving, and I want to be part of making sure it survives and thrives." Tom nodded. "Richard's learned a lot these past few months. About business, about leadership, about the difference between cost and value. He's young. He'll figure it out." "With the right mentorship," Tom said meaningfully. A year later, I was promoted to Executive Vice President of Sales and Client Development, with a seat on the board of directors. Richard and I had developed a working relationship based on mutual respect rather than hierarchical authority. He focused on strategic planning and operational efficiency. I focused on client relationships and revenue generation. The company's revenue had grown by 40% since my return, and we'd landed several major new accounts. More importantly, our client retention rate was the highest in the industry. But the real victory wasn't in the numbers or the promotions or the increased compensation. It was in the principle that had been established, that experience and relationships have value that can't be quantified on a spreadsheet or replaced by cheaper alternatives. The morning Richard had fired me, he'd said that 3 interns could handle my job. He'd called me a costly burden, dismissed 16 years of service as expendable overhead. He'd been wrong about everything except one thing. I had been costly, but not in the way he'd imagined. My real cost to the company was my absence, the price of losing client trust, of broken relationships, of institutional knowledge walking out the door, the cost of learning that some things can't be replaced, only rebuilt, slowly, carefully, and expensively. As I sat in my office that Friday evening, looking out at the Seattle skyline and reviewing the week's accomplishments, I couldn't help but smile. The inbox that had exploded with 127 angry emails had taught everyone involved a valuable lesson about the difference between price and value. 3 interns couldn't replace one man with 16 years of trust, but one man with 16 years of experience could teach an entire company what really mattered. Richard had said it wasn't personal, that it was just business. He'd been right about that too. It was just business. And in business, as in life, you eventually get exactly what you pay for. But the story doesn't end there. 6 months after my promotion to the board, Richard approached me with a proposal that surprised even me. We were in the break room on a Thursday afternoon, and I was making my usual cup of coffee when he sat down at the small table nearby. "Lance, I've been thinking about something," he said, his tone more serious than usual. "I want to apologize, not just for the firing, but for everything that led up to it." I looked at him over my coffee cup. "We've moved past that, Richard." "No, I don't think we have. Not really." He ran his hand through his perfectly styled hair, a gesture I'd learned indicated he was genuinely troubled about something. "I've been going through some of my father's old files, trying to understand how he built this company. Do you know what I found?" I waited. Letters, dozens of them, from clients, from employees, from suppliers, all talking about the relationships he'd built, the trust he'd earned, the way he treated people like human beings instead of line items on a budget. Richard looked out the window at the Seattle skyline, and then I found his notes about you. "What kind of notes?" "He'd been tracking your career development since your 3rd year with the company." Page after page of observations about your client relationships, your mentoring abilities, your potential for leadership. He saw something in you that I completely missed. I set down my coffee cup. Richard, your father was a remarkable businessman, but he was also human. He made mistakes too. Maybe, but not about people. Never about people. Richard looked directly at me. He wrote that you were the kind of employee who could carry the company forward for the next generation. That firing you would be like cutting out the heart of the sales department. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Finally, Richard continued. I want to make you an offer, a partnership, not just board membership, but actual equity ownership. 20% of the company with full operational control over sales and client development. I nearly choked on my coffee. That's very generous, Richard. It's not generosity, it's smart business, the kind my father would have made. He smiled ruefully. The kind I should have been making from the beginning. I spent that evening discussing the offer with Susan. 20% ownership would make me wealthy beyond anything I'd ever imagined. But more than that, it would give me the security and authority to truly build something lasting. What's the catch? Susan asked as we sat on our back patio watching the sunset. No catch that I can see. Richard seems genuinely committed to learning from his mistakes, and the board is fully supportive. Then what's holding you back? I thought about that. Fear, maybe. Fear that it's too good to be true. Fear that I'm not ready for that level of responsibility. Susan laughed. Lance, you've been ready for years. You just never had someone willing to give you the chance. The next morning, I accepted Richard's offer. The legal paperwork took 3 weeks to finalize, but by the end of the month, I was officially a partner in Hartwell & Associates. The news sent ripples through the business community. Several trade publications ran stories about the unusual arrangement. The veteran employee who'd been fired and returned, not just as an executive, but as an owner. Lance Thompson's promotion from fired employee to partner in less than a year is unprecedented in our industry, wrote Business Weekly's Seattle correspondent. It speaks to both the value of experience and the cost of losing it. But the real test came 6 months later, when we faced our first major crisis as partners. It started with a phone call on a Monday morning in March. Margaret Stevens called an emergency board meeting for that afternoon, which immediately told me something serious was happening. We have a problem, Margaret announced as soon as everyone was seated in the conference room. Meridian Industries is considering terminating their contract. Meridian Industries was our largest client. The $40 million logistics deal I'd negotiated years earlier had grown into a comprehensive partnership worth over $60 million. Annually, losing them would be catastrophic. What's the issue? I asked. Robert Morrison slid a folder across the table. They're claiming breach of contract, saying we failed to meet delivery commitments on the West Coast expansion project. I opened the folder and scanned the documents. The complaints were detailed and specific. Delayed shipments, missed deadlines, communication failures. But something didn't add up. This doesn't make sense, I said. I've been in regular contact with their procurement team. They've never mentioned any of these issues. Richard looked uncomfortable. Actually, Lance, I've been handling some of the Meridian communications directly. I thought it would be more efficient to manage their expansion project at the executive level. I felt a familiar sinking sensation. What exactly have you been managing? Nothing major, just some operational details, timeline adjustments, resource allocation decisions. Margaret looked between us with growing alarm. Richard, please tell me you didn't make commitments without consulting the operations team. I made some adjustments to the delivery schedule, Richard admitted. Meridian was pushing for faster implementation, and I thought we could accommodate them. I closed the folder and looked at him directly. Richard, what did you promise them? 2-week acceleration on all deliveries, plus additional services that weren't in the original contract. The room fell silent. Finally, Robert spoke. Can we deliver on those commitments? Not without significant additional resources and overtime costs, I said, which would turn this from a profitable contract into a loss leader. Margaret rubbed her temples. How did we get into this situation? Richard's face was flushed with embarrassment. I thought I could manage it. I thought the experience I'd gained over the past year would be enough. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city while I processed the situation. This was exactly the kind of crisis that had led to my firing 18 months earlier. Richard making decisions without understanding their implications. But this time was different. This time, I had the authority to fix it. Here's what we're going to do, I said, turning back to the table. I'm going to call Marcus Rodriguez directly and arrange a face-to-face meeting. Richard, you're coming with me. Is that wise? Margaret asked. Given the circumstances? It's necessary, I replied. If we're going to be partners, Richard needs to understand how these relationships actually work. And Marcus needs to see that we're taking this seriously. The meeting with Marcus Rodriguez took place 2 days later in Meridian's downtown office. Marcus was professional but clearly frustrated as he outlined their concerns. Lance, I've worked with you for 16 years. When you tell me something will happen, it happens. But these past few months, we've gotten promises that weren't kept, timelines that were unrealistic, and communication that frankly made us question whether Hartwell and Associates was the same company we'd been working with. I nodded, taking notes on every point. Marcus, I want to apologize for the confusion. There were some internal miscommunications that led to unrealistic commitments being made. Internal miscommunications? Marcus's voice carried an edge. Lance, we're talking about a $60 million partnership. We don't have room for miscommunications. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair but remained silent as we'd agreed beforehand. You're absolutely right, I said. And here's what we're prepared to do. First, we're going to honor every commitment that was made, regardless of the cost to us. Second, we're implementing new communication protocols to ensure this never happens again. And third, we're prepared to offer additional services at no charge to make up for the inconvenience we've caused. Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying me. That's going to cost you significantly. Yes, it is, but not as much as losing your trust would cost us. The meeting lasted 3 hours. We went through every contract detail, every timeline, every commitment. By the end, we'd worked out a revised agreement that satisfied Meridian's needs while minimizing the financial impact on our company. As we were leaving, Marcus pulled me aside. Lance, I appreciate you taking responsibility for this, but I have to ask, is Richard ready for the level of responsibility you're giving him? I looked back at Richard, who was gathering his papers with the focused intensity of someone who'd learned a hard lesson. He's learning, Marcus, and sometimes the best education comes from making mistakes and having to fix them. Fair enough, but if this happens again? It won't, I said firmly. You have my word on that. The drive back to the office was quiet for the first 10 minutes. Finally, Richard spoke. That was humbling. It was supposed to be. I cost us about $2 million in additional services and overtime costs. Yes, you did. Another long silence. How do you do it? How do you maintain those relationships across so many different personalities and companies? I considered the question as we navigated Seattle's afternoon traffic. It's not about managing relationships, Richard. It's about building trust. And trust is built one conversation at a time, one kept promise at a time, one crisis handled well at a time. But how do you know what promises you can keep? Experience. And more importantly, humility. When I don't know something, I say so. When I need to check with the operations team before making a commitment, I do that. The client would rather wait for accurate information than get fast information that turns out to be wrong. Richard nodded thoughtfully. I've been approaching this like I was still in business school, trying to impress people with decisiveness and confidence. Confidence is important, but competence is more important. And competence sometimes means admitting what you don't know.